The lecture hall was massive, and it stretched across 3 levels of the Galactic Coalition Military Academy on Desser. Prime in the walls glowed with a soft blue light that came from the advanced technology built into every surface, and the ceiling displayed a slowly rotating map of the known galaxy, with all 47 member worlds marked in bright golden dots. Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole sat alone in the back row, and he could feel the eyes of every alien in the room turning toward him every few minutes, and he was used to it by now because he had been the only human at this academy for 3 months, and humans were still considered newcomers to the galactic stage, and many species looked at him like he was some kind of primitive creature who had somehow stumbled into a place where he did not belong. The seats around him were filled with officers from across the Coalition, and the Shivani were tall beings made of living crystal that caught the light and scattered it in rainbow patterns, and the Nethri were serpentine creatures with scales that shifted color based on their emotions, and the Grundok were massive 4-armed warriors whose people had been fighting wars since before humans had learned to use fire. And there were at least a dozen other species, and each one had centuries or thousands of years of spacefaring history behind them. At the front of the hall stood Instructor Vethkal, and he was a Corvani, which meant he looked something like a giant insect with a hard shell covering his body and compound eyes that seemed to see everything at once. And his shell was covered in ceremonial scars from the 6 interstellar wars. He had survived, and every species in the Coalition knew his name because he was considered the greatest tactical mind in 3 spiral arms. Marcus had studied hard to get into this academy, and Earth had only been part of the Coalition for 40 years, and humans were still proving themselves and being selected for this program was a great honor, but it also meant he was under constant scrutiny, and every mistake he made would reflect on all of humanity. Vethkal activated the holographic display, and a 3-dimensional image appeared in the center of the room, showing 2 fleets of ships engaged in combat, and the instructor began to speak, and his words were translated instantly by the device implanted behind Marcus's ear. Today, we will discuss the foundation of all civilized warfare, said Vethkal, and his mandibles clicked as he spoke, and the sound was strangely rhythmic, and we will discuss proportional response. Marcus leaned forward slightly because he had heard about this concept many times since arriving, and it seemed to be the core principle that guided how every Coalition species fought their wars. The instructor continued, and his compound eyes swept across the room, and every action in warfare must be measured, and every response must be calculated to match the threat, and nothing more and nothing less. And this is what separates civilized species from barbaric ones, and this is what has maintained peace among Coalition worlds for 9,000 years. A Grundok officer raised 2 of his 4 arms, and he asked a question about whether there was ever value in using more force than strictly necessary, and Vethkal's response was immediate and firm. Excessive force is what we call overkill, and it is wasteful, and it creates unnecessary casualties, and it breeds cycles of revenge that can burn for generations. And no civilized species practices overkill, and the Corvani abandoned such primitive tactics 12,000 years ago. Marcus felt something tighten in his chest because he knew where this was going, and he had prepared for this moment ever since he learned the topic of today's lecture, and he had brought his datapad with him, and it contained files he had compiled over many sleepless nights. Vethkal turned to look directly at Marcus and his compound, eyes fixed on the human with an intensity that made some of the nearby officers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Perhaps our human guest can provide some perspective, said the instructor, and his translated voice carried a tone that might have been curiosity or might have been condescension. And Sergeant Cole, your species is new to our ways, and you have only been traveling among the stars for 3 centuries, and in your military history, can you provide a single example of what we would classify as overkill? And I am curious what a young species considers excessive. The hall fell completely silent, and Marcus could feel every eye in the room turning toward him, and the Shivani refracted the light nervously, and the Nethri scales shifted to colors of anticipation, and the Grundok leaned forward with all four arms crossed, and everyone was waiting to see what the primitive human would say. Marcus thought about everything he knew about human history, and he thought about the wars that had shaped his species, and he thought about the weapons that humans had created, and the destruction they had caused, and he almost wanted to laugh, because the instructor had asked for one example, and choosing just one was the hardest part. He stood up slowly, and he reached for his datapad, and he connected it to the Academy's display system, and he made sure his voice was steady when he spoke. Instructor Vethkal, said Marcus, and he looked directly at the ancient Korvani warrior. And you asked for one example of overkill, and with respect, I need to tell you that choosing just one example is difficult, because human history is full of them. The room stirred and murmurs passed between the various species, and Marcus continued speaking, but I did not come here unprepared, and I have studied your coalition doctrine, and I have studied how you define overkill, and I have brought proof of what humanity is capable of. He activated his datapad, and the holographic display flickered and changed, and a new image appeared in the center of the room, and it showed a small blue planet with white clouds and green continents and vast blue oceans. This is Earth, said Marcus, and this is where my species learned to fight and what I am. About to show you is not a story or an exaggeration, and it is historical fact, and every piece of data I present can be verified through independent sources. Vethkal's mandibles clicked slowly, and the instructor said nothing, and he simply watched and waited, and Marcus could tell that he had the attention of every single being in that hall. I want you to understand something before I begin, said Marcus, and when humans fight, we do not fight to wound or to intimidate or to establish dominance. And when humans truly commit to a war, we fight to win, and our definition of winning might be very different from yours. He took a breath, and he looked around the room at all the alien faces watching him, and he made a decision that would change everything. I'm going to show you 3 examples, said Marcus, and the first example will shock you, and the second example will disturb you, and the third example will make you understand why humanity should never be underestimated, and when I am finished, you will know exactly what human overkill looks like. The display behind him began to change, and the first images started to appear, and Marcus Cole began to teach the Galactic Coalition a lesson they would never forget. The holographic display changed, and Marcus Cole watched the faces of the alien officers as the first images began to appear, and he could already see confusion on some of them because they did not understand what they were looking at. Before I show you the weapons, said Marcus, I need to give you some context, and I need to explain what was happening on Earth at this time, and in the year 1945 by our calendar, which was about 380 years ago. Humanity was in the middle of the era of what we call the Second World War. A Nethri officer raised a scaled hand, and he asked what made it the Second World War, and Marcus appreciated the question because it gave him an opportunity to set the stage. We call it the Second World War because it was the second time that almost every nation on our planet was fighting at the same time, said Marcus, and the first one happened about 30 years earlier, and together these 2 wars killed nearly 100 million humans. The room went absolutely still, and Marcus could see Vethkal's compound eyes widened slightly, and the Grundok officers exchanged glances with each other, and the Shivani made a sound like crystal chimes that the translator identified as disbelief. 100 million, asked Vethkal, and his voice was very quiet. And of your own species? Yes, said Marcus, and we were fighting ourselves, and we were fighting over territory and resources and political power and ideology, and by the time the Second World War reached its final year, we had already lost 60 million people, and the war was still not over. He changed the display, and now it showed a map of Earth with different colors indicating different sides of the conflict, and he pointed to a small island nation in the Pacific Ocean. This nation was called Japan, said Marcus, and they had attacked my nation, the United States, several years earlier, and we had been fighting them across the Pacific Ocean, and it was brutal and bloody, and both sides had suffered terrible casualties, and by 1945, we had pushed them back to their home islands, but they refused to surrender. The display showed footage from the war, and it was old and grainy, but the images were clear enough, and they showed soldiers fighting on beaches and ships burning in the ocean and cities reduced to rubble by conventional bombing. Our military leaders estimated that if we invaded Japan directly, it would cost between 500,000 and 1 million American soldiers, said Marcus, and Japanese casualties would be between 5 and 10 million, including civilians, and our leaders decided that this cost was too high. So you sought a peaceful solution, said a Shivani admiral, and her crystalline body pulsed with what looked like approval. No, said Marcus, and his voice was flat, and we did not seek peace, and we sought a different kind of weapon. The display changed again, and now it showed a crude metal device that looked like a large bomb with fins on one end. And next to it was a diagram showing the internal mechanisms, and Marcus gave the aliens a moment to study it. We had been working on a secret project for several years, said Marcus, and our scientists had discovered a way to split the atom and release the energy that holds matter together, and we called it nuclear fission, and we built this energy into a weapon that we called the atomic bomb. He pulled up the specifications, and the numbers appeared on the display for everyone to see. A single bomb, said Marcus, and it was small enough to be carried by one aircraft, and it contained the explosive equivalent of 15,000 tons of conventional explosives. The Grundok commander leaned forward, and all four of his arms gripped the armrests of his seat, and he spoke slowly as if he could not believe what he was hearing. One bomb, he said, with the force of 15,000 tons. That is correct, said Marcus, and on August 6, 1945, we dropped one of these bombs on a Japanese city called Hiroshima. The hologram changed, and now it showed an aerial view of a city, and it was a normal city with buildings and streets and a river running through it, and there were people going about their daily lives. And then the image shifted. A blinding flash of light filled the display, and then a massive mushroom cloud rose into the sky, and the city below it simply disappeared. And when the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but rubble and ash and shadows burned into stone where human beings had been standing just a moment before Marcus let the silence stretch out, and he watched the horror spread across the faces of every alien in the room, and even Vethkal seemed frozen in place. 80,000 people died instantly, said Marcus, and his voice was quiet, but it carried through the silent hall, and another 60,000 died in the following weeks and months from radiation, poisoning and burns and injuries, and one bomb and one aircraft and one city gone in a flash of light. No one spoke, and the only sound was the soft hum of the Academy's life support systems. And, Marcus continued, the Japanese government did not surrender. Vethkal made a sound that the translator could not identify, and his mandibles clicked rapidly. And he spoke in a voice that sounded almost broken. They did not surrender, he repeated, and after that, they believed we only had one bomb, said Marcus, and they thought it was a terror weapon and not something we could use again. And so 3 days later, we dropped another bomb on a different city called Nagasaki. The display showed the second explosion and the second mushroom cloud, and the second city turned to ash, and the numbers appeared again, and 40,000 dead instantly, and another 40,000 in the months that followed. Then they surrendered, said Marcus, and the war ended. He paused, and he looked around the room at the shocked faces and the horrified expressions, and he let them process what they had just learned, and then he spoke again. This is not my example of overkill. The room erupted, and every alien started speaking at once, and the noise was overwhelming, and Marcus simply stood there and waited for them to calm down, and Vethkal raised one of his limbs, and The room slowly fell silent again. "How can this not be overkill?" demanded the instructor. "And you destroyed 2 cities, and you killed hundreds of thousands of your own kind." "Because it ended the war," said Marcus. "And it saved millions of lives that would have been lost in a conventional invasion. And it was terrible, and it was horrifying, but the force we used was proportional to the objective of ending a global conflict." He changed the display and new information appeared, and the aliens stared at it with growing dread. "What I am about to show you," said Marcus, "is what happened after we built those first bombs, and what we did next, and then you will understand what human overkill really looks like." Marcus Cole could see that the alien officers were still trying to process what he had shown them, and their faces displayed emotions that ranged from horror to disbelief to something that looked almost like fear, and he knew that he was only getting started. "The bombs we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were primitive weapons," said Marcus, "and they were first-generation technology. And we had invented them only a few years earlier, and within 2 decades, we built bombs that were 1,000 times more powerful." The display changed, and now it showed a comparison chart, and on one side was the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, and it was labeled as 15 kilotons, and on the other side was a much larger bomb, labeled as 50 megatons, and the difference in scale was almost impossible to comprehend. "The Tsar Bomba," said Marcus, "and the Soviet Union built this weapon in 1961, and it was the largest nuclear device ever detonated, and its explosion could be seen from 1,000 kilometers away, and the shock wave traveled around the Earth 3 times a." Nethry officer spoke, and his voice was barely above a whisper, and his scales had turned a pale gray color that indicated extreme distress. "Why would anyone build such a thing?" he asked. "And what enemy could possibly require such destruction?" Marcus nodded at the question, because it was exactly the right question to ask. "The enemy was ourselves," said Marcus, "and after the Second World War ended, the world split into 2 major powers, and the United States and the Soviet Union, and we did not trust each other, and we were afraid of each other, and we began to build nuclear weapons as fast as we could." The display showed a graph, and it tracked the number of nuclear warheads held by both nations over time, and the line started low in 1945, and then it began to climb, and it kept climbing year after year and decade after decade. "At the peak of what we called the Cold War," said Marcus, "these 2 nations possessed over 70,000 nuclear warheads between them, and we had enough destructive power to destroy every city on Earth multiple times over, and we had missiles that could deliver these weapons to any target on the planet within 30 minutes, and we had submarines hidden in the oceans that could launch attacks even if our entire nation was destroyed." The room was completely silent, and Marcus could see that some of the aliens were struggling to understand, and he decided to make it clearer. "Imagine," said Marcus, "that you had enough weapons to destroy your entire planet several times over, and then imagine that your enemy also had enough weapons to destroy your entire planet several times over, and both of you knew that if either side attacked the other, would launch their weapons in response, and everyone would die. This is insanity," said a Grundok commander, and his 4 arms were trembling slightly. "We called it mutual assured destruction," said Marcus, "and we shortened it to MAD, and the idea was simple, and if both sides knew that any war would destroy everything, then neither side would start a war, and it worked, and for nearly 50 years. 2 nations pointed enough weapons at each other to end all life on Earth, and they never fired them." Vethkal spoke, and his voice was different now, and it carried something that sounded almost like respect. "You created a weapon so terrible that its only purpose was to never be used," he said, "and you understood that the threat of absolute destruction was more powerful than destruction itself." "Yes," said Marcus, "and this is what humanity learned, and we learned that sometimes the most effective weapon is one that is never fired, and we learned that overwhelming force can prevent war instead of causing it." He changed the display again, and now it showed a map of a different region, and it was a desert with a small nation highlighted in the center. But you asked for a concrete example of overkill, said Marcus, and not just theoretical capability, and so I will show you what happened in 1991 when a nation called Iraq invaded its smaller neighbor Kuwait. The display showed military formations and troop numbers and equipment lists, and the aliens studied the information carefully. Iraq had the fourth largest army in the world at this time, said Marcus, and they had over 1 million soldiers and thousands of tanks and a veteran military, hardened by 8 years of previous warfare, and they invaded Kuwait and seized control of the country. A coalition of human nations decided to liberate Kuwait, said Marcus, and we assembled a force of nearly 1 million soldiers from 35 different countries, and what followed was called the Gulf War. He began to play footage, and it showed aircraft taking off from carriers and bases, and it showed missiles streaking through the night sky, and it showed explosions lighting up the darkness. For 38 days we conducted an air campaign, said Marcus, and we flew over 100,000 combat missions, and we destroyed their command and control centers and their communications networks and their power grid and their transportation systems and their air defenses and their supply lines. The display showed the systematic destruction, and it showed radar installations being hit by precision missiles, and it showed bridges collapsing, and it showed convoys being targeted from the air. When we were finished, said Marcus, the Iraqi army was blind and deaf and starving, and they could not communicate with their own units, and they could not move their forces, and they could not get supplies to their soldiers, and we had not put a single ground soldier in danger. Efficient, said a Shivani admiral, and her tone was analytical now. And this is good military practice. We were not finished, said Marcus. The display changed, and now it showed night vision footage of a highway, and it was packed with vehicles stretching for miles, and the vehicles were bumper to bumper, and they were trying to retreat from Kuwait back to Iraq. This is what we called the Highway of Death, said Marcus. And when the Iraqi forces tried to retreat, our aircraft caught them on the open road with nowhere to hide and nowhere to run. The footage showed the attack, and it showed missiles and bombs falling on the convoy, and it showed vehicles exploding and burning, and it showed the aftermath. When the sun rose, and the road was covered with destroyed vehicles and bodies scattered across the sand for miles in every direction. When the ground war finally began, said Marcus, it lasted 100 hours, and not 100 days and 100 hours. And we lost fewer than 300 soldiers, and Iraq lost somewhere between 20 and 35,000, and we destroyed over 3,000 of their tanks, and we captured 80,000 prisoners. He let the numbers sink in, and then he spoke again. The fourth largest army in the world, said Marcus, and we erased it in 100 hours, and this is what human overkill looks like. The lecture hall remained silent for a long time after Marcus finished speaking, and the alien officers sat motionless in their seats, and some of them stared at the display that still showed the aftermath of the Highway of Death, and others looked down at their hands or at the floor, and Marcus could tell that they were trying to process everything they had learned. Vethkal was the first to speak, and the old instructor rose from his position at the front of the hall, and he walked slowly toward Marcus, and his compound eyes studied the human with an intensity that made Marcus feel like he was being examined at the molecular level. Sergeant Cole, said Vethkal, and his voice was quiet and thoughtful, and you have shown us that your species possesses a capacity for violence that exceeds anything in coalition military doctrine, and you have shown us weapons that could destroy entire worlds and campaigns that annihilated armies in days. He paused, and his mandibles clicked slowly. And then he asked the question that Marcus had been waiting for. What I do not understand is why, he said, and why does your species fight this way? And every species in this room has an evolutionary or cultural reason for their approach to warfare. And the Kovani developed our tactics because we evolved as ambush predators, and the Grundok fight to settle disputes between their hive clans, and each species has a history that explains their methods. He fixed his compound eyes on Marcus and continued, but humans describe themselves as social creatures, and you say, you are cooperative and you build communities and you care for your young and your elderly, and yet your warfare is the most destructive in the known galaxy. And how do you explain this contradiction? Marcus had expected this question, and he had thought about how to answer it for a long time, and he spoke carefully because he wanted them to truly understand. Have you studied human evolution, Instructor? He asked Vethkal. Nodded, and his antennae twitched slightly. Superficially, he said, and I know that you are what we call endurance predators, and you developed a hunting technique called persistence hunting, where you would chase prey for hours until it collapsed from exhaustion. That is part of our history, said Marcus, but it is not the most important part, and for most of our evolution, we were not predators at all, and we were prey. This statement caused a stir among the alien officers, and several of them made sounds of surprise, and Marcus continued, we were not the fastest animals on our planet, said Marcus, and we were not the strongest, and we did not have natural weapons, like claws or fangs or armor, and we survived because we could think ahead, and because we could work together, and because we could run longer than anything else could chase us. This does not explain your capacity for overkill, said a Nethri officer, and his scales were shifting through colors of confusion. It does, said Marcus, and he began to pace slowly in front of the display, and you see, we learned very early in our evolution that the greatest threat to a human was not a predator with sharp teeth or powerful muscles, and the greatest threat to a human was another human. The room stirred again, and Marcus could see understanding beginning to dawn on some of the faces. Other animals fight for territory and for mates and for resources, said Marcus, and they fight until one side establishes dominance, and then they stop and the loser submits, and both animals walk away alive, and this is how most species settle their conflicts. But humans learned something different. He continued, and we learned that if you defeat an enemy, but you leave them capable of fighting, they will come back, and they will attack you when you are weak, or when you are sleeping, or when you are busy with something else. And they will not forget, and they will not forgive. So you developed a doctrine of total destruction, said Vethkal, and his voice was neutral, but Marcus could hear something underneath it that might have been comprehension. We developed a survival strategy, said Marcus, and we learned that the only way to truly end a threat was to end it completely. And this became part of our instincts, and it became part of our culture. And when humans go to war, we do not fight to wound or to intimidate, or to establish dominance, and we fight to win. And our definition of winning means the enemy can never threaten. Yours again. He stopped pacing and he turned to face the assembled officers. But there is another part to this, said Marcus, and it is equally important. And we also learned that fighting is expensive, and fighting costs lives and resources and time and energy. And if you can avoid a fight, you should avoid it. How do you avoid fighting? Asked a Grundok commander. And if your enemies know, you will destroy them completely. Would they not attack you first out of fear? That is where deterrence comes in, said Marcus, and we learned that if you make the cost of fighting you so catastrophic that no rational enemy would ever start a war with you, and you demonstrate this capability clearly enough that everyone believes it, and then you do not have to fight at all. He pointed to the display which still showed the devastation of the Gulf War. This was not just about defeating Iraq, said Marcus, and this was about sending a message to every other nation on Earth, and the message was simple, and if you threaten us, we will destroy you so completely that you will never recover, and not in years, and not in decades, and not ever. The room fell silent again, and Marcus could see that the aliens were beginning to understand, and Vethkal spoke. Slowly, you use overwhelming force as a deterrent, he said, and the purpose of your overkill is not destruction for its own sake, but prevention of future conflicts. Yes, said Marcus, and this is what I wanted you to understand, and humans are not mindless killers, and we do not enjoy destruction, and we do not seek war for its own sake, and we fight the way. We fight because it works and because it saves more lives in the long run than any other approach. We have found, he looked around the room at all the alien faces, and he spoke one more time, and everything I have shown you today was humans fighting against other humans with rules of engagement and laws of war and all kinds of restrictions on what we could and could not do. And I want you to imagine what we would do to an enemy that truly threatened our species, and an enemy that was not human, and an enemy that we felt no obligation to show mercy. The silence that followed was the longest of the day. 3 months had passed since that day in the lecture hall, and the situation at the Galactic Coalition Military Academy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted, and Marcus Cole was no longer sitting in the back row as a curiosity, and he was now standing at the front of the room as a tactical advisor. The holographic display behind him showed a map of the desert sector, and red markers indicated the positions of enemy ships, and the room was filled with senior officers from a dozen different species, and they were all looking at Marcus with expressions of focused attention. The Vreth Collective has been testing our defenses for 6 weeks, said Marcus, and they have been sending small groups of ships into coalition space and measuring our response times and analyzing our communication protocols and studying our patrol patterns. Vethkal sat in the back of the room, and the old instructor had taken to attending every one of Marcus's tactical briefings, and he rarely spoke, but he listened carefully to everything the human said. The Vreth are not members of the coalition, said a Shivani admiral, and her crystalline form pulsed with concern, and they have rejected 3 offers of membership, and they believe that we are weak. They believe our doctrine makes us predictable, said Marcus, and they have studied proportional response for 50 years, and they know exactly how we will react to any given situation, and they are using this knowledge to plan an invasion. The room stirred with alarm, and Marcus changed the display to show a Vreth 4 base that was hidden in an asteroid field near the edge of Coalition territory. This is their staging point, said Marcus, and may have been using it to coordinate their reconnaissance missions, and they believe we do not know about it, and they believe they are safe. What do you recommend? Asked Abba, Grundok fleet commander, and his 4 arms were crossed in a posture of intense concentration. I recommend that we destroy this base completely, said Marcus, and we should do it without warning and without negotiation, and we should eliminate their entire forward capability in this sector in a single strike. The room fell silent, and the officers exchanged uncertain glances, and the Shivani admiral spoke first. That would be a significant escalation, she said, and it would violate every principle of proportional response. That is exactly the point, said Marcus, and his voice was calm and confident, and the Vreth have spent decades studying how we fight, and they think they know our limits, and they think they can calculate exactly how much force we will use in any situation, and we need to prove them wrong. You want to frighten them, said Vethkal from the back of the room, and his voice was neutral, but there was something underneath it that sounded almost like approval. I want to deter them, said Marcus, and there is an important difference, and right now the Vreth are calculating whether they can win a war against the coalition, and they are adding up our forces and our weapons and our response patterns, and they think the answer is yes. He changed the display again, and now it showed the Vreth fleet formations and their estimated strength and their projected invasion routes. If we respond to their probes with proportional force, they will factor that into their calculations, said Marcus, and they will absorb whatever damage we do, and they will continue with their plans, and eventually they will attack and millions will die. But if we destroy their forward base without warning, said Marcus, and if we prove that the coalition is capable of disproportionate response and of overwhelming force and of what you call overkill, then they have to recalculate everything. A Nethri officer raised a scaled hand, and his voice was cautious. "What if destroying their base provokes the invasion instead of preventing it?" he asked. "And what if they see our attack as an act of war?" "Then we destroy their fleet," said Marcus, "and then we destroy their supply lines, and then we destroy their shipyards, and we show them that the coalition is not just capable of proportional response, and we are capable of whatever response the situation requires." He looked around the room at all the alien faces, and some of them looked uncertain and some of them looked worried, but some of them were beginning to understand. "The goal is not destruction," said Marcus, "and the goal is deterrence, and we want the Vreth to look at what we do to this base and decide that the cost of war is too high and that they should find another way to achieve their objectives. And if we do this right, we will save millions of lives on both sides." Vethkol rose from his seat and walked to the front of the room, and he stood beside Marcus, and his compound eyes swept across the assembled officers. When Sergeant Cole first arrived at this academy, he said I asked him for a single example of overkill, and I expected him to describe some primitive excess from his species' violent past, and instead, he taught us something that we should have understood a long time ago. The instructor's mandibles clicked slowly, and he continued, "Overkill is not barbarism," he said, "and it is not mindless destruction, and it is a tool and a capability that, when properly controlled, can prevent more violence than it causes, and the coalition has maintained peace through agreement and mutual restraint, but the Vreth do not share our values, and they see our restraint as weakness." He turned to look at Marcus, and something passed between them that might have been respect or might have been gratitude. "Perhaps it is time to show them strength," said Vethkol. The vote was held the next day, and it was unanimous in 3 days. Later, 27 coalition warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel directly above the Vreth 4 base, and the attack lasted less than 4 minutes, and when it was over there was nothing left but scattered debris floating in the asteroid field. Among the attacking ships were 2 vessels that carried names chosen specifically for this mission, and they were called the CNS Hiroshima and the CNS Highway, and every species in the coalition understood exactly what those names meant. The Vreth Collective demanded an emergency summit, and they accused the coalition of unprecedented aggression, and they called for sanctions and reparations and justice, and the coalition's response was delivered by a human ambassador. "Your forward base was a message," she said, "and if you require another message, we have 94 warships currently positioned within striking distance of your homeworld, and they are waiting for my signal." The Vreth invasion never came, and the border skirmishes stopped immediately, and within a year the collective had signed a non-aggression treaty that they had been refusing to consider for decades, and peace was maintained not through proportional response but through the credible threat of overwhelming force. And in the halls of the Galactic Coalition Military Academy, a new doctrine was added to the curriculum, and it was taught by a human sergeant who had arrived with nothing but a data pad full of historical records, and who had proven that sometimes the best way to prevent a war is to show your enemy exactly what you are capable of. The lesson was simple, and it was this: the best weapon is one you never have to use in the second. Best weapon is one you only have to use once, and humanity understands both of these truths better than any species in the galaxy. And that is why you should never ask a human for just one example of overkill, because they will give you proof, and that proof will change everything you thought you knew about warfare, and about peace, and about what it truly means to be civilized. The end.